The sea was never meant to be gentle, and neither were they. Cannons roared, smoke filled the air, and the black flag that once terrified the world fluttered for the last time as the tide of battle turned. The crew that had defied kings, robbed empires, and ruled the waves now faced their final defeat. Among them stood women fierce, fearless, and unyielding, their hair tangled with salt and blood, their eyes fixed on the horizon they would never see again. They were not supposed to exist. In an age where women were forbidden to fight, they became captains, warriors, and legends. They commanded ships, led crews of men, and carved their names into the pages of history with steel and defiance. But when they were finally captured, their courage met a new kind of cruelty. What awaited them was not only punishment, but judgment. To the empires that ruled the seas, these women were more than pirates. They were an outrage to the order of the world. Their fates would serve as warnings, their suffering as a spectacle. This is the untold story of the world's most daring women of the sea, and what happened when the waves that once carried them to freedom turned against them. For centuries, the sea was considered no place for a woman. Ships were thought to be cursed by their presence, and most societies believed that women belonged on land far from storms, blood, and battle. Yet when the winds of the 17th and 18th centuries filled the sails of the golden age of piracy, a few women defied every rule written against them. They did not simply survive in a man's world, they conquered it. The early 1700s were an age of chaos on the oceans. Nations were at war, trade routes were booming, and lawless waters stretched from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. The lure of gold, freedom, and power drew outlaws from every port, deserters, escaped slaves, and those rejected by the world above deck. Among them, hidden in plain sight, were women. Some disguised themselves as men to join crews. Others seized command through force, cunning, or sheer willpower. And a few became legends. In the Caribbean, Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed under the black flag alongside the infamous Calico Jack Rackham. Anne, born in Ireland, was fiery and fearless, known for her temper, sharp tongue, and unmatched courage in battle. Mary, raised in disguise as a boy to secure her inheritance, had lived her entire life defying gender expectations. When the two met aboard Rackham's ship, they became an unstoppable force, fighting shoulder to shoulder, pistols drawn, against ships that vastly outnumbered them. Contemporary witnesses spoke of their ferocity. During one famous encounter, when their male crewmates hid below deck in fear, Anne and Mary stood on deck and fought until they were overwhelmed. It wasn't just piracy, it was rebellion against a world that had never given them a place to stand. Far across the seas, another woman ruled with even greater power. Ching Shih, a Chinese widow who inherited her husband's fleet in the early 19th century, commanded more than 300 ships and tens of thousands of pirates. Where others used chaos, she built an empire. She created a strict code of laws, controlled trade routes, and demanded tribute from coastal governors and merchants. Even the Chinese Imperial Navy struggled to contain her. Ching Shih didn't just survive piracy, she perfected it. And long before any of them, in the stormy waters off Ireland, there was Grace O'Malley, known as the Sea Queen of Connaught. In the 1500s, she led her own fleet, defied English rule, and negotiated face-to-face with Queen Elizabeth I. Grace was not just a pirate. She was a ruler, balancing diplomacy and defiance in an age that tried to silence her. What united all these women was not greed or cruelty, but freedom. For them, piracy was more than theft, and it was escape. The sea offered a kind of equality that the land never could. On deck, skill mattered more than gender. A woman with a sword, a pistol, and courage could command respect or fear just as any man could. But the freedom they found on the waves came at a cost. Every pirate knew that capture meant death, yet for women the consequences were often more complex. They were judged not only as criminals but as women who had defied their place in the world. The law did not just see them as pirates, it saw them as a threat to the very order of society. Their courage turned to legend, their defiance to myth. But history remembers what happened next when the empires struck back, and the oceans that once sheltered them became traps. They had lived like queens of the sea. Now they would face a world determined to remind them that freedom, for women, was never meant to last. For years the names of Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shih, and countless others echoed across oceans. Merchants whispered them in fear, and royal navies sent ship after ship to hunt them down. But every legend, no matter how bold, eventually meets the tide of its own downfall. For the women who had defied empires, the end came not through weakness but through betrayal, exhaustion, and the relentless power of the world they had dared to challenge. In the Caribbean, Bonny and Mary Read's reign came to an end in 1720. After years of plundering ships off the Bahamas, their crew, led by Calico Jack Rackham, was ambushed by a pirate-hunting sloop sent by the governor of Jamaica. It was night. The pirates, drunk and unsuspecting, scrambled to defend themselves, but only two stood their ground. Witnesses later testified that Anne and Mary fought fiercely, shouting for the men to join them. When no one did, the women fired their pistols and swung their cutlasses until they were overpowered. Their defiance, even in defeat, became part of their legend. The men were quickly sentenced to hang, but Anne and Mary's fate took a different path. They were women, and that changed everything. The law saw not just outlaws, but unnatural figures, women who had lived as men, fought as men, and refused to be silent. Their capture was not only a victory for the crown, it was a symbolic act meant to restore the moral order they had broken. Half a world away, Ching Shih faced her own reckoning. By 1810, her empire of ships had become too large, too powerful, and too impossible to ignore. The Qing dynasty, desperate to restore control of its coasts, launched a full naval campaign against her. But Ching Shih was no ordinary pirate. Knowing she could not win forever, she used her greatest weapon strategy. She negotiated directly with the Chinese government, securing a pardon not just for herself but for her entire fleet. She surrendered her arms, married a loyal lieutenant, and retired with wealth and honor. She was one of the few pirates in history, man or woman, to walk away unpunished. Most, however, were not so fortunate. Female pirates captured by European or colonial authorities were rarely shown mercy. Many were tried publicly, their stories twisted into cautionary tales. To the powerful, these women were more than criminals. They were symbols of rebellion that had to be destroyed. Their trials drew crowds. The same societies that had ignored their existence when they were free now turned them into spectacles. Reporters wrote about their clothing, their looks, their unnatural boldness. The message was clear. Women who defied their place in the world would be broken publicly, their courage turned into shame. Yet even in chains, many refused to bow. When asked why she chose the life of a pirate, Bonny reportedly replied, "I'd rather see the world and die young than live a quiet life and never know freedom." Those words echoed far beyond her cell. The sea had given these women freedom, something the world had never offered them. But once captured, they faced a punishment worse than death, to be forgotten or rewritten by the very world that had always feared them. When the battles ended and the cannons fell silent, another kind of war began, the battle for judgment. For the women who had ruled the seas, their trials were not only about law but about morality. They were judged not simply for their crimes, but for what they represented, women who had refused to stay in their place. In the Caribbean, Bonny and Mary Read were thrown into a dark, damp cell in Jamaica to await trial. The court records from 1720 describe the proceedings in chilling detail. Before the judges sat two women dressed in men's clothing, their hair unkempt but their eyes defiant. The prosecutor accused them of piracy, robbery, and murder on the high seas, crimes punishable by hanging. But the tone of the trial was not about justice. It was about restoration of order. The courtroom was crowded with spectators. Many had come not to witness a legal process, but to see something that defied their worldviews. Women who had fought and commanded men. To them, Anne and Mary were unnatural beings, symbols of chaos that needed to be erased. Their story had become a moral lesson before the verdict was even read. During the trial, both women admitted to being pirates but refused to apologize. When one of the judges condemned them for abandoning their feminine virtue, Anne reportedly shot back with words that silenced the court. "If you'd fought like men, you wouldn't be hanged like dogs." Those words would echo through centuries, a final act of defiance against a world that demanded submission. In the end, the court found them guilty and sentenced them to death. But both declared that they were pregnant, a plea known in the law as pleading the belly. Under English custom, a pregnant woman could not be executed until after childbirth. The judges postponed their sentences. It was the last weapon they could use, not a sword or pistol, but life itself. Mary Red would die in prison a few months later, likely from illness after giving birth. Anne Bonny's fate remains a mystery. Some say her father used his wealth to free her. Others believe she vanished, living the rest of her life under a new name. The truth is lost to time, but her legend endured. In Asia, justice took a different shape. Ching Shih, through negotiation and cunning, avoided trial entirely. Her leadership, discipline, and intelligence forced even her enemies to respect her. She retired peacefully, a stark contrast to the tragic fates of her Western counterparts. The trials of female pirates revealed not only the fear of rebellion, but the deeper fear of women who refused to conform. Courts described them as monsters, unnatural, or lost souls, because to the men who judged them, their existence itself was an act of defiance. And yet, in those courtrooms, amid the chains and verdicts, these women left behind something stronger than their sentences, a legacy of resistance. They proved that courage could exist even in defeat, and that silence would never fully bury their names. Judgment in the courtroom was only the beginning. For most pirates, the final sentence came not from the judge's mouth but from the gallows. Yet for women, punishment took on another dimension, one crafted to shame, to humiliate, and to remind the world of its order. In the Caribbean, the prisons of Port Royal overflowed with captured pirates in the early 1700s. Among them were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, chained and awaiting their fate. The men of their crew had already been executed, hanged at gallows point, their bodies left on display as warnings to others who dared defy the crown. But Anne and Mary's fate was delayed when they pleaded their bellies. Pleading the belly was one of the few protections available to women under English law. If a woman could prove she was pregnant, her execution was postponed until after childbirth. Sometimes it was a temporary reprieve. Other times it saved their lives entirely. Mary died in prison before her execution could take place. While Anne's story vanished from the record, a silence that left historians wondering whether she escaped or was quietly released. For most female pirates, however, there was no escape. Those who fell into Spanish, Portuguese, or British hands faced the same merciless fate as men hanging, drowning, or lifelong imprisonment. The only difference was that their punishment carried a public message, that a woman who lived as a pirate would die not just as a criminal, but as a warning. Executions were often public spectacles. Crowds gathered at docks and courthouses to witness the fallen women of the sea. Newspapers and pamphlets eagerly described their faces, their clothing, even their final words. But what fascinated the public most was not their crimes, it was their defiance. These women who refused to weep or repent unsettled the world that condemned them. In Asia, punishments varied. Ching Shih's survival was an exception, not the rule. Most captured women in her fleet were imprisoned or sold into servitude. Empires feared what these women represented: independence, command, and the refusal to be controlled. Destroying them was as much about preserving authority as it was about enforcing law. But even in their punishment, the women's courage endured. Some met death calmly, refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of fear. Others used their last breath to mock the men who had judged them. In those moments, their power returned not as queens of the sea, but as symbols of rebellion that no rope could silence. The gallows took their bodies, but the stories survived. In whispers at taverns, in songs sung by sailors, in legends told by fishermen who swore they still saw ghostly ships on stormy nights. The women who once ruled the waves lived on. Not every pirate story ended at the gallows. A few women, through luck, cunning, or sheer will, managed to escape the noose and live to see the world they once defied. Their stories became part legend, part mystery testaments to the strength that had carried them across oceans and through storms. Among the most famous survivors was Bonny. After her trial in Jamaica in 1720, she vanished from history's records. Some said she escaped from prison. Others whispered that her wealthy father pulled strings to secure her release. A few accounts claim she settled quietly in South Carolina, married again, and lived out her days in peace, a strange ending for a woman who once fought with pistols blazing under the black flag. Whatever her fate, Bonny's legend endured. To those who told her story, she became more than a pirate. She was a symbol of defiance, of a woman who refused to live by the rules of men or nations. Her comrade, Mary Red, was less fortunate. She died in prison, but even in death her story carried power. Raised as a boy, she had fought in wars, joined pirate crews, and lived a life of freedom denied to most women of her time. In her final days, she reportedly spoke not of regret, but of the freedom she had known, a freedom she considered worth any price. Across the world, another survivor wrote her own ending, Ching Shih, the most successful pirate in history. By 1810, her fleet ruled the South China Sea. When the Chinese Imperial Navy finally cornered her, she did what no pirate before her had done. She negotiated. Instead of fighting to the death, she secured a pardon for herself and her entire crew. She even kept her fortune and married her trusted lieutenant, Chung Po-tsai. After surrendering, Ching Shih lived as a respected businesswoman, running a gambling house until her death decades later. The same woman who had once commanded 40,000 men and terrorized nations retired peacefully, proof that even in a world built to destroy women like her, some could bend fate to their will. Other women simply disappeared into history. Some disguised themselves again, taking new names and vanishing into ports and villages where no one would recognize them. Others were absorbed into slavery or domestic servitude, their pasts erased by force. Their silence, however, was not complete. Their stories survived in whispers, in sailors' songs, and in the frightened admiration of those who had once hunted them. Even centuries later, writers and historians would struggle to understand how these women existed at all. They were anomalies in their time, warriors, leaders, and rebels who had stepped outside every boundary society had drawn. The very idea of their survival challenged the world that condemned them. But perhaps the greatest survival of all was not of their bodies, but of their stories. They refused to die. From Bonny's vanished fate to Ching Shih's unlikely victory, these women became immortal in legend. Their courage was retold not only in history books, but in the hearts of anyone who ever felt trapped by the limits of their world. They had lived on their own terms, fierce, free, and fearless. And even when history tried to bury them, the tide of time could never wash their names away. When the age of sails faded and the flags of empire replaced the skull and crossbones, the world tried to forget the women who had ruled the seas. Historians wrote books about great admirals, captains, and explorers, nearly all of them men. The stories of female pirates, once shouted in fear and awe, were reduced to whispers, myths, or curiosities. But legends have a way of surviving, especially those born from defiance. For centuries, the names of Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shih, and others drifted between fact and folklore. To the empires that once condemned them, they were inconvenient reminders. Women who had refused to obey, who had proven that courage and command knew no gender. So history quietly buried them. Their records were lost, their trials forgotten, and their graves unmarked. But their stories refused to stay silent. Sailors sang about them in taverns. Poets wove their courage into ballads. Even in obscurity they lived on, not as criminals, but as symbols of freedom. In the 19th century, when tales of piracy turned into adventure myths, their names reappeared in books and plays, often twisted or romanticized. Writers portrayed them as temptresses or tragic figures, missing the truth of who they were. Women who had seized control of their own lives in a world that denied them everything. It would take modern historians centuries later to uncover their real courage. Ching Shih's name resurfaced in China as a figure of admiration, not shame. In time, she became celebrated as one of history's most successful commanders, a strategist who forced emperors to negotiate peace. Grace O'Malley, too, was remembered in Irish folklore as a rebel who fought for her people's freedom. Her story retold in songs and monuments along the coast she once ruled. But perhaps the greatest part of their legacy lies in what they represent. The idea that freedom, once seized, can never truly be taken away. These women lived in an age that tried to silence them, yet their choices echoed through generations. Their defiance became a mirror for every woman who refused to bow, every person who dared to challenge the rules written against them. Modern storytellers, filmmakers, and historians continue to revive their memory, and not as villains, but as pioneers. They remind us that history's forgotten corners often hold its bravest hearts. In the end, the sea remembers. Its waves still whisper their names to those who listen. Tales of rebellion, courage, and the hunger for freedom.